Alrighty then, what happened in here? So when I was a kid, my room would often get like this, and when my dad came in, he would say things like, "Well, I have some bad news for you. The Nazis broke in again. They trashed your room." Or, "So did the Nazis find what they were looking for?" Which is, of course, in reference to the Indiana Jones movies when the Nazis would come in and toss the room looking for stuff. And then, of course, there was the one girl who trashed her own room and then blamed it on the Nazis. Not sure why that exact story came to mind at the moment, but at least I finished the dress in time. That's what really matters. So, like many of you, I adore 18th century fashion, specifically American colonial and Western European fashion. It just rides such a beautiful line between consistency and versatility. The fabrics are beautiful, the silhouette is flattering. What's not to love about 18th century fashion? And like many of you, I was very inspired by Bernadette Banner's modernized 18th century dress she made a few years ago. Prior to seeing that video, if I was going to modernize an 18th century look, what I would have done is modernize the silhouette, but keep some of the more stylistic elements, like the split skirt with the contrasting petticoat underneath. I would have kept the sleeve fringe. I would have kept the stomachers with the lace-ups. I would have kept the most iconic elements, but tried to modernize the silhouette. When I watched Bernadette's video, that was really the first time it had even hit my brain that it might be better to simplify the stylistic elements but maintain the original silhouette. And what she made has just such a striking look. However, the question I've been trying to solve for over a year now is how exactly to make that work for me, because Bernadette is very slender, and I feel like about 95% of the people watching her video were like, "This looks beautiful on you," but there is no way in heck that would work for me. She was able to basically get away with just interfacing the front section. Most people out there, myself included, would need more support than that. And I'm just like, I'm fairly small. You know, here's what we're talking about. So if I couldn't get away with that, I'm guessing very few people could. Hence my year-long journey to figure out ways to achieve the 18th century silhouette, but with a more modern approach. I have come up with several possibilities that I wanted to discuss today. This isn't a tutorial, it's more of a breakdown of my ideas and thoughts on the subject, and some of the different approaches I've taken and how well they worked, and where I think my next steps will be going forward. So I have 4 projects to show you, and let's get started. So the first piece I made last year after finishing my video breaking down the Outlander bodices is I made an attempt at kind of a modernized version of that, and the hypothesis I was trying to test was whether or not I could use a flat stomacher but still have princess seams and still have kind of a more normal modern bust silhouette. This worked with mixed success. I would say with my bust size, I didn't have too much of a problem with it trying to curve. The stomacher did stay pretty straight. Historically, things were done the way they were done for a reason. And whenever you try and break away from that, sometimes you can do it, sometimes you can't, but you have to be considerate of the cause and effect in trying to figure out why they did what they did and the purpose it served. So when I tried to make this with princess seams, the reason I decided against it in the long run is because when your bust sits below the line that you are lacing up, the tighter you lace it, it becomes very restrictive. You might think that the 18th century conical style would look more uncomfortable because it looks like it's laced tighter. The way those bodices were shaped, they funneled everything up. So your chest capacity, your lung capacity is funneled up too. So your breathing shifts, and instead of breathing more outward, you breathe more upward. It actually works well for the bust because all of the excess is being funneled upwards. Whereas with this princess seam style, you have a pocket for the bust. But when you are lacing across that pocket, you're trapping the bust. And at the neckline, you have this tight ridge that sits above the bust line, and you have very little room for chest expansion as you breathe. So this kind of style, I would say it works fine for a costume, or if you were going to make anything more modernized and less fitted. But if you want it to be truly, form-fitting 18th century style, this is limited. For the construction, it is pretty simple. The outer layer is an acrylic flannel. The inner layer is a cotton sateen. Same thing for the stomacher. I have a lot of boning channels that I made on the inside. I found that to be unnecessary and way too much, and I ended up taking the boning out of everything except for these 2 side channels and then the front channel. I have another channel here that I never boned, but it was more intended as a waist tape to keep it in place. And I tried to make it kind of flare but fitted along my hips, and that part of the pattern worked out great. But this was an experiment that proved to me that princess seams are not what I want to go for. The next piece I made was my more historically accurate stays, which I made last November and December. There is a full and long tutorial about how to make these if you are interested in them specifically, and I really, really love these. These were my attempt at being as historically accurate as possible for the learning experience. However, here are a couple of the things that I have learned in the time since I finished them. For all of the history bounders out there, I would not wear these every day. I wouldn't. I won't. I know it's not going to happen. There is a lot of interest in stays right now, especially among plus size women and those with larger busts that have a lot of pain that comes from their bras, whether that be shoulders or back pain, what have you. There is a lot of interest in stays as a replacement. I don't have much that I can say on that issue because I don't have pain from bras, so I don't know if this would be better for some people out there, but I do know that with these, they are very thick. They're fully boned, so I mean, they're thick. And they're pretty heavy too. And I know for a fact that I would not be comfortable, these would not be compatible with my modern lifestyle. If you were going to try and modernize a pair of stays to actually wear around as an experiment, here are a couple things I would say. One, don't go with full boning, go with partial or half boning. You just don't need that much. Two, I would try to cut out some of the layers because these were built the way they were built for a reason. I don't think in modern life we need them to be that sturdy and thick, especially not if it's your first pair that you're just wanting to try out. And then another thing I would add is that if you are looking at this as a source of pain relief, having a pair of stays that goes all the way down to your hips can help because it distributes the weight more evenly around your body. But I think that having straps would be even better too, because then you're distributing it even more thoroughly. The weight isn't completely resting on your shoulders, but neither is it completely resting on your hips. It's just the best possible distribution. Another thing that I'd like to add, something that I learned after finished these. This center split I made, I only added it because it was in the original pattern, but it does have a very important function, especially if you are larger busted. Okay, if you have this laced completely closed, you can see there is a little bit of room for it to kind of expand for your bust, but not very much. With this split, there is a ton of extra room and space that opens up to allow the bust to sit a little bit lower. So if you are a larger busted woman looking into making yourself a pair of stays, I would definitely look for a pattern that does have a split or add a split to your pattern. It is a very, very helpful thing. Okay, the next attempt was much more recent. These I just finished a couple weeks ago. I kind of dubbed this project the 18th century sports bra. The idea was to take the pattern that I used for my red stays because I had already used it, I already knew how it fit me and what I would want to change, and to try and convert that into almost a pair of Regency short stays, but without the added bust darts for the new bust shape that they preferred. I wanted to see if I could make something that would give me the correct 18th century bust shape, but which would be much more lightweight and comfortable. I'm planning a repeat of this project, and there are a few things I'm going to do differently, but overall, this was by far the most successful thing yet. I only have a few things that I can wear underneath, but I have been wearing them around and they are pretty comfortable. I know that the question is going to be, is it more comfortable than a bra? I can't really say a definitive yes or no to that because frankly, it's been very hot out and my air conditioning has been broken and I live in the Midwest and we have very high humidity in the summer. And if you're going to ask me whether I would wear this or a regular bra, the answer is neither. As far as using this underneath a dress like Bernadette's, I think that it's not the best solution, but it is a good solution. It's going to give you the correct bust shape because it doesn't come all the way down to the hips. It's not going to give as much structure to the bodice. So either you might be able to see lines or you might need to add more boning to the bodice. I think that it's a huge step up, but it's not quite the answer I'm looking for yet. Another theory that I was testing with this project is I wanted to see if I could make a pair of stays that I could modernize to the point of not needing a shift underneath. And like I said earlier, whenever you modernize something, you have to consider why it was done and you have to consider what your modern response to those original requirements are. are. So the requirements of a shift are it keeps the stays clean, it adds comfortability, and it has the bust control section at the top. I lined them in a soft linen. I wanted to see if that would be comfortable enough for me to function with, and I think that yes. I don't really think that adding another shift underneath it would make that big of a difference. And then as far as washability goes, I used plastic boning and then stainless steel spiral boning for the bust rail portion. So it is washable, although I did not pre-wash my linen and it got a little bit warped when I washed it. So, you know, that's my bad. And then the last function of the shift is the bust control portion. As I talked about earlier, the shape of the 18th century silhouette kind of funnels everything up. And the downside of that is that it's quite improper in a modern setting. So the bust control portion, what I did, my workaround, is I cut a section out and I added a panel that's all gathered up, and that fulfills the bust control portion. If I was going to be wearing it with a dress that was not washable, I would still want to wear a shift with sleeves because you want to keep the armpit area from getting disgusting. But for what it is, I think that it works really well and it was a very good prototype. The only downside of having this bust control section is that it kind of limits your options. So for the next version of this I'm going to make one without this panel in it because I want to kind of test out and experiment with the differences. So as you can see, they are a gray linen. They are interlined with the thick linen canvas that I had left over from those stays. The inner layer is just a very thin, very soft linen. I kind of used a variety of time periods for technique. I added boning channels at the seams, and then I added a kind of half-boned stays pattern that I pretty much just eyeballed at the front. I used the exact pattern from those stays, but I've just kind of cut them short. And then I tested with my mock-ups to add the straps directly to it because I kind of hate the dangling strings that you have everywhere with historical stuff, especially in a modern setting. I just don't want to deal with that. And these do fit perfectly fine. I don't think that it is necessary to have them tie in place. I think the only added benefit from that would be a little bit added mobility because it would have more flex. You know, I'm fine with them. I'm fine with them. And then the last project that I have to tell you about, it's a story, let me tell you. So Michaela and Andy got married on Saturday. They decided to cancel their big wedding and just do a little COVID wedding, get married, and then have the big full wedding with the big party reception next year. So she decided she wanted to save her fancy wedding dress, she wanted to save our bridesmaids' dresses, and instead she asked me to make her a very simple white dress. And then for the bridesmaids, she told us to just come up with whatever we wanted to wear, but then she gave us some parameters. So the parameters were blush pink, add some sparkles, and then to me specifically, she said, not 50s. By which I'm sure she actually meant just modern, but she wasn't that specific. So you know what? She liked it anyways. It's fine. She said she was fine with it, okay? So my thought process was, I have to make a pink dress out of polyester fabric that I'm never going to wear again. This would be a great opportunity to experiment with 18th century patterns. So for this one, I pretty much poured everything I love about 18th century into one design. I started from the same Janet Arnold pattern that Bernadette Banner started from for her video. It wasn't really intentional, but there's not that many to pick from, and I really liked the shape of this line on the pattern, and I thought that the back of it would be the easiest to try and alter. This went through quite a lot of alteration before I actually made it. I wanted to try one of these fishtail ruffles. I wanted to do the, whatever this contrast piece is called. I did add a zipper. I changed the pattern shape of these considerably because I wanted them to cover that, even though I ended up not wearing that underneath. So in order to structure this, I did add interfacing to this very thin polyester fabric. For the front sections, I cut 2 layers of the lining linen. I sewed them together around all of the edges, flipped them right side out, and then I drew boning channels on, sewed them in place, seam ripped little snippets to insert the boning through, and then stitched around all of the edges, and then I hand stitched it to the bodice. That worked really well, and I'm going into a lot of detail about this one because I was in a absolute gut rush. I only had a week to make this, and I ended up having to hand sew most of it because of this stupid beaded sequin fabric. So I filmed absolutely nothing. There will be no tutorial on this particular one, but hopefully later there will be a tutorial when I can make a better version. but this worked pretty darn well. I don't think that this bust rail was exactly necessary. As far as structure goes, this actually did the job almost perfectly. It does add more work to the dress to add all of this boning, but if you're just looking at making a special occasion dress, or you just want to try it out and see how it works, kind of make a pattern prototype, I think that this was a very good solution. The bust didn't stay in place perfectly, but I think that a solution to that would be to kind of sew some half moon-shaped pads underneath the bust, but that was pretty minor. I did not bone the back panels. I used some heavy cording, and I thought that that would be enough. In general, I think that if you're making 18th century, if you make it come just straight across this bottom edge, the back isn't going to wrinkle too badly. But if you make it come down as a peak, the back will wrinkle right at the small of your back where it bends. So if you're going to do that, I think that boning in the back is absolutely mandatory, and I didn't do that here, even though I definitely could have. And yes, excuse the brown zipper. I didn't have a separating zipper in stock that would match, and I didn't feel like going to the store, and I was in a hurry. And then there is the matching petticoat. This was the first time I used just like the straight up 18th century side closure method, and for modernization, I don't see a reason to do that. I'm not going to do that again. And here is why. It makes sense historically why they would have done closures like this, because you had weight fluctuations, you had frequent pregnancies, your clothes would go on to someone else when you were done with them. They didn't just get tossed into a Goodwill bag. History bounding to me means taking the best of every time period. And to me, this is not the most practical thing. It just kind of made it hard to keep the skirt sitting in place. And part of that is because I wasn't wearing stays underneath the skirt, and part of it is because it comes up a little bit high at the bodice edge. This isn't an accurate representation of how these work. This is how this closure method worked with my modernization method for the bodices. In the future, making 18th century petticoats, I will not be doing this. I will just add a normal waistband. Okay, rant over. Okay, now we come to the fun part. I want to show you the original pattern I started with, and after 4 mock-ups, the pattern that I ended up with. And I want to show you the differences so that you can kind of use that information if you want to attempt modernizing an 18th century pattern, and kind of use it to inform the alterations you make. Okay, so this is the original Janet Arnold pattern, and this is the pattern I ended up coming up with. And, you know, this will probably be easier to show you the differences if I digitize it real quick. Okay, so here you can see them overlaid, and the red is the original, the blue is what I came up with. And hopefully you can see better some of the changes that were made. The most notable one is the base of the waist right here, and that has been whited out by a little bit more than an inch, and the reason for that is because I made this dress to wear with no stays underneath, and stays do have a bit of a waist cinching effect. But for modernization purposes, even if I was wearing a full pair of stays underneath them, I would not be cinching the waist as much as the originals would do. So that is a big change to look for when you're modernizing a pattern like this. The other big one, actually this one's probably even more important, is the shoulders right here. You see the shoulder has been moved inward quite a lot. Because whenever I've tried to modernize an 18th century pattern, and I feel like it's just the trend, it's just the way the silhouette was, I don't think that my shoulders have anything to do with it specifically, but whenever I try to use a historical pattern, I find that these shoulders are very wide set, very tight, and very pinching, and you don't have much forward movement, which for a modern lifestyle is kind of necessary. So I moved that forward quite a lot, and I just kind of freehanded, eyeballed that, and then tweaked it over the course of a few mock-ups. I also made that strap a lot longer, and you see it even comes up higher in the back, so the entire shoulder section has been widened out quite a lot. If you notice how wide the strap gets as it gets to the back, the reason I widened it out that far is because I was planning on wearing it over my gray stays, but with no sleeves, and so the stays were going to show. I think that it could go either way. Do you hear that bird? My theory is that if you create yourself a well-fitting, basic pattern like this, it can be used pretty much universally for any 18th century pattern you want to make. All you have to do is relocate the cuts that you make in the extra panels for the back. You can play around with the peak in the front, the peak in the back, you can play around with the neckline and the strap, but it's a flat panel, which makes it so much easier to just create however you want. So I guess my main takeaway from this project is that 18th century bodices aren't as scary as I thought. Even though they are super weird looking, especially if you're used to sewing with modern bodice patterns, the fact that they are cut so flat is such an advantage, because if you can get it right one time, you have so much room for versatility within even just one pattern, just all in the placement of the panels. So yeah, that is what I learned from this project, and let me know what you thought.